Welcome to another episode of Underground Strategy, and today we're diving into, if I may say, one of the most significant conflicts of the 20th century. I think Sean will agree with me on that one, the Spanish Civil War, fought between 1936 and 1939. It was a multifaceted struggle, left and right, different ideologies, you had different identities and international interests, and was really a precursor in many ways to the Second World War. And today, to guide us through it all, who better than Séan Scullion, a historian, senior army officer, and the author of the book, and may I say the new version in Spanish, no less, Españoles contra el Nazismo, which only a year ago was released under the English title, Churchill Spaniards, and very well received. And then, Sean, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hola, Tony. ¿Qué tal? All great. It's great to be with you guys again, and I'm really glad that you asked me to come on.
We're honored to have you. Let's begin with the basics of this conflict, and for our listeners who may not be too familiar with it, what were the main causes of the Spanish Civil War, and in 1936, what is the tipping point?
Well, you can break up the Spanish Civil War reasons into three kind of groupings, really. You've got long-term reasons, you've got medium-term reasons, and short-term reasons. And it's difficult to know where to start with this sometimes. There's a book by Carr, which I believe is, if I remember rightly, it's the history of Spain, 1808 to 1939. And that's a pretty good start. You could go all the way back to the Napoleonic era, but you can actually start by talking about a decline, Spanish decline. It's all about the decline of a Spanish empire, Spain having to give up its empire in the early 1800s, and then going into a decline from there, really. And you've got the first constitution of Spain being written in 1812, and Spain does not really properly take that further democratically beyond 1812. And you get a series of governments where it's one side or the other. Elections don't really matter as much. Some people might say they do. They do to a certain extent, but overall you get the same kind of groups of people taking over. And at the 1800s, the 19th century is marked by a series of pronunciamientos, which are coups by the military, by the army specifically. So long-term wise, we're talking about this decline, Spanish Empire decline, and that kind of long-term reasoning and the kind of background culminates in 1898 with the fall of the last more extended elements of the Spanish Empire in Cuba and in the Philippines, where the Spanish lose very heavily against the United States in the Philippines and in Cuba. And that really sets a rot into Spanish society. You have, funnily enough, I mean, we'll cover it later, but funnily enough, one of the witnesses to this as a small child is Franco Valmonde. He actually sees what's left of the Spanish fleet returning to harbour in 1898. So he kind of witnesses that final kind of stab in the back for the Spanish Empire as such. Some people will call it that. So that rot is set in, and getting into the medium-term reasons, you enter the 20th century, and Spain goes through its industrial revolution in the early 1900s. It hasn't gone through its industrial revolution like the rest of Europe in many ways. And during the First World War, it declares itself as neutral and actually goes through quite a quick and rapid industrial kind of transformation and ends up providing material and goods for both sides in World War I. And with that comes the beginnings of turmoil in society as such, where you start to see the working class majority having a voice, especially in politics. The rise of socialism, anarchism in Spain, which has already kind of taken a foothold in Spain in the late 1800s, but really is accentuated even more as you get into this industrial turmoil. And this brings about a series of very violent occurrences where rich industrialists in cities like Barcelona decide to use mercenaries, thugs, to take out and kill leading members of unions, trade unions and things like that, and spirals into a bit of chaos. Coupled with this, you also have the various disasters that are happening in what's left of the Spanish Empire in North Africa, and the several defeats that end up culminating in the Battle of Anhuel, the disaster of Anhuel, and the humiliation of Spain by an insurgency in North Africa, in Morocco as we know it today. Then that brings about a first major dictatorship General Primo de Rivera steps in 1923. He's supported by the king, Alfonso XIII, who is the grandson of Queen Victoria. And of course, he's cousins with the Kaiser, and he's also cousins with Tsar Nicholas and George V. I think there's quite a famous photo of them together. You can see it online. But I think it's about 1912 or something like that. There's a famous photo of them at a wedding or a funeral or something. Anyway, and Alfonso XIII supports Primo de Rivera taking over, and Primo de Rivera is an immediate hit in the sense of the word that he reestablishes a lot of things. He launches a lot of public works programs, very similar to what Mussolini does, but he really does not grip the country in the way a lot of people wanted him to. And in 1929, Spain really struggles after the Wall Street crash, the economic crisis of the world, and he becomes very unpopular. And by that stage, we're talking about the return of people wanting their country to get rid of the monarchy. Primo de Rivera steps down. There is a movement towards a republic. The royal family go into exile to Rome. Alfonso XIII, he dies not soon after. And his father, the Juan de Borbón, is in exile. And soon after that, the republic is fully declared. Elections take place and Spain goes into a republican phase. And this is where we start to get close to the short-term reasons for the Spanish Civil War, because 1931, a left-wing government takes power and there's sweeping reforms. You've got to remember that intermingled amongst all of this, you've got a huge amount of the country dominated by a very small percentage of the population, landowning minority owning the majority of the land, industrialists having a huge influence over the cities. You've also got the influence of the Catholic Church and the influence of the military, of course. And by this stage, the military has redeemed itself slightly in North Africa. Parts of the army have been reformed, but the army still has too many generals and too many senior officers. And the army is also a fairly well practiced in counterinsurgency, especially those who've served in Africa. And one could say that the army is split into two parts, an army that's based in Spain and hasn't gone anywhere, and the army that's fought in Africa. And it's the army officers and the soldiers in Africa that become key in the Spanish Civil War. So the first socialist left-wing leaning government brings in lots of reforms to help with education, agrarian reform, giving the vote to people who have been given the vote before. And of course, this produces a counter kind of movement from the right wing. And in 1933, the right wing take power in the elections, which in turn produces a backlash from the left. And there is a very well-known revolt by miners in Asturias, which is repressed by the Spanish government of the time, the right-wing government of the time, and actually they turn out to use the army to repress it. And the officer in charge of that is Francisco Franco Bahamonde, and he becomes the chief of staff of the army soon after. And the left are quite broken up. The right are fairly well organised, whereas the left aren't as well organised because they've got lots of disparate groups that make up that part of the political spectrum. But they do bring together a popular front of parties, and they win the elections in January 1936. And at this point, the army makes the decision that it's going to try and take power again, just like it's done several times in the 1800s. And in March 1936, there's a meeting of officers in Madrid, including General Mola, who is the planner of the insurrection, of the coup, and Franco as well. But Franco still hasn't decided if he's going to get involved. But Franco has been banished to the Canary Islands, and Mola, who's been in charge of the Army of Africa, I think he's made like regional governor of the north. Pamplona, he's been sent up to somewhere like Pamplona. But that doesn't stop them from meeting up. And it's decided that the military coup is going to take place, and General Sanjurjo, who's already tried once to take over power in the early 30s, he's going to be the leader of the coup. And what people have traditionally called the spark that set off the fire that became the coup was two deaths that occurred in June and July. I think it's July actually, 1936. The Republican government had set up its own kind of police force, guardias de asalto, And a fairly well-known lieutenant of that police force in Madrid was murdered in, I think it's like the 12th of July or something like that. And the day after, the leader of the right-wing coalition, CEDA, he's called José Calvo Sotelo. He is picked up to go out for a stroll, un paseo, but obviously he's chucked in a car, driven to the outskirts of Madrid, shot in the back of the head, and his body's dumped. And that is the excuse that the coup makers give for why they start the coup. The rebellion, as it was called, as it's traditionally been called, started on the 17th of July, 1936. So that's the reasons. There's quite a lot there to unpack, and we'll go through it as we go, I'm sure, Tony.
That is a lot, Sean, and you've done it really well. I mean, we're talking about the prestige of the former kingdom, at this point a republic. You've mentioned the overblown officer corps, the agrarian issues versus those in cities, class issues. There's a lot in there. And then, of course, that political element, which it's crazy. I mean, to think that a republic is formed at that time, right? Like just with the history of Spain, it's when one looks back, or at least for me, it's almost unbelievable.
I agree. I think a lot of people have said if Spain was an animal, it was a bit of a guinea pig. A lot of things were tested out in Spain in the late 1800s and early 1900s, politically, amongst and other things. Obviously, we can talk about experimentation in warfare during the Spanish Civil War as well. But yeah, it is pretty crazy. I mean, Spain did need reforming. It was just a question of how. The problem was that the reforms, good or bad, were always going to cause a problem amongst the population. And that's why, for many people, the Spanish Civil War literally was brother against brother, father against son, in warfare, sister against brother and all that kind of stuff. It literally split. You've got a prime example, somebody we know very well in our day-to-day lives in the UK, for example, Michael Portillo, Miguel Portillo, as it would be called in Spanish, Michael Portillo. His father, Luis Portillo, was an academic in Spain, and he had members of his family who were on the other side, and his father had to go into exile at the end of the Spanish Civil War. As you say, chaos is a very good word.
Enjoying the episode? Leave a review wherever you listen. YouTube, hit subscribe to keep us going. Let's carry on.
It's very interesting the way you've mentioned that about people being forced to go into exile then and afterwards. I mean, we can touch on that later. And you put it very well, Sean. So we have these factions, some of them a little bit more hodgepodge, and things come to a head. You've detailed the causes there, but can you give us kind of high-level overview of the back and forward of the war between 1936 and 1939, and how that balance shifts between the Republicans and the nationalist forces over time?
Yeah, so the Republican side stayed named the Republican side as such, democratically elected, the legitimate government of Spain. The nationalists were called the rebels initially, and you could call them nationalists later on in the war, really. But obviously, it's important for me to at least outline the fact that the Spanish Civil War didn't start off as a civil war. It started off as an attempted coup, and it only became a civil war probably nearly 6 months after it started. So you have the beginnings of the war, the attempted coup, let's say. It was all very touch and go. Mola came up with this plan. The plan was basically to try and take the major cities, with the army taking control of those major cities. The top three major cities of Spain are Madrid, the capital, Barcelona, and Valencia. And some of the other major cities that were important to them were cities on the coasts and some inland cities as well. You could be talking about places like Bilbao, Santander, Gijón in the north. You can talk about Malaga, Algeciras, for example. Algeciras was very important, strategically very important, because they needed to capture that in order to get the troops over from Africa. Spain had a lot of troops in Africa still at the time. And of course, the plan was to take these places and use the Army of Africa, based in North Africa at the time, to cut across to mainland Spain and be the main force that would be able to secure the army's position and take over control of the country if the remaining troops in mainland Spain weren't able to do that. Key to this was rapidity, making sure it was going to work quickly, and also ensuring that those different elements of the army were commanded by the right people. So Mola was immediately going to step in with the army that was rising up in the north of Spain, central north, a bit between Madrid and the coast. He was based in Pamplona. And Franco, who was based in Canaries, they had to come up with a means of getting him across to Morocco to join up with the Army of Africa. And this is a very quick, weird story. This is what happened. Basically, the rebels came up with a plan. They were supported by a millionaire called Juan March. Juan March paid for an aircraft, which was actually a British aircraft, flew from Croydon via Bordeaux, Lisbon, landed in Tenerife, and even worse, the pilot was a member of the Secret Service, the British Secret Service, so it's even, you couldn't make these things up. Franco gets picked up, he gets taken to another island, and then from there he goes to North Africa, to Tetuan, and he joins up with the army and he takes command. He immediately sends deputations to Mussolini and Hitler, personally sends people, the people who were working for him, to ask for their support. They immediately say yes, and they send transport aircraft, Junkers, etc., to North Africa to help Franco get his troops across the Strait of Gibraltar. Meanwhile, in the rest of Spain, and we're talking 17th, 18th, into the early kind of 20s of July in 1936, the rest of the army is trying its best to take over control of the major cities, and it fails in Madrid very badly. It fails horrendously badly in Madrid, and also in Barcelona. But Barcelona is quite a bloodbath, in fact, as is Madrid, and the army fails. And it also fails in Valencia, and it fails in other cities in central, southern Spain. But Mola is able to take key cities in the northern parts. He's helped in Pamplona by the fact that you have the people from Navarre who are very loyal to an old pretender to the monarchy, and they sign a deal with the nationalists, well, the rebels at the time. And basically the troops in Africa get across the Strait of Gibraltar. They're flown into Seville. One of Franco's friends is able to take Seville city centre and the airport there. They're flown into Seville. They then pretty much ransack Seville, overtake the working class districts of Seville, and then they go in this huge column, they call it the Columna de la Muerte, and drive north to Madrid. And three things happen between August 1936 and November 1936. The first thing is that they take the city of Badajoz, where the first major massacre of Republicans takes place in the Bullring there, very famous massacre there after the capture of the city. And then for some bizarre reason, Franco decides he's going to take Toledo. And the reason why he's going to take Toledo is for three reasons. One, because Toledo has been holding out against the Republicans. The officer academy is there, and they've been holding out this big siege. It's not been very successful for the Republican side. So he's going to relieve the Alcázar in order to get a huge propaganda coup. He's going to save the people in the Alcázar. What he's going to do is he's going to use that propaganda as a means to fully establish himself as the leader of the rebels. Because the day the insurrection starts, Sanjurjo is taking off from Lisbon airport and his aircraft crashes. So there's no leader anymore. So Franco sees an opportunity and he uses this propaganda coup to help him cement his position. And at the same time, what he does is he manages to get the junta, the group of generals, to agree to him becoming the generalissimo, the commander-in-chief. And he becomes the commander-in-chief, I think it's in September. Anyway, he becomes generalissimo. And shortly after, in October, he is made caudillo, which is the Führer, basically. And so he cements his power. And after that, the fact that they spent a couple of extra weeks having to take Toledo means that Madrid is able to defend itself, because that's what they're aiming for. They're aiming for Madrid. The column of death, the Columna de la Muerte, is aiming for Madrid. And in early November, the first Battle of Madrid happens, and the rebels are not able to take the city. And from then on, it becomes a civil war, really, because they're not able to take the capital. The Republican government has fled to Valencia by this stage, and the rebels, the nationalists, attempt a second attack on Madrid by trying to cut it off on the southeastern side. And you have the famous Battle of Jarama in February 1937, famous because this is the second time that people from other organizations have fought for the Republic and for the nationalist side. And obviously by autumn of 1936, you've got two groups of people siding with the nationalists, the rebels, Hitler and Mussolini, and the Russians are now supporting the Republic. The Republic is desperate. It doesn't really have an army as such. It doesn't have much equipment, so it has to go to people like Russia because Britain decides to establish a non-intervention committee, which means that it's going to prevent people from taking part and supporting one side or the other in the war. Lots of similarities with Ukraine, if I'm brutally honest. However, the non-intervention side is rigidly enforced by Britain and followed by some other countries. But funnily enough, members of the non-intervention committee are also the Russians, the Germans, the Italians, but they're still siding with the two different sides in the civil war. So it's total chaos. Jarama is a truce, let's say. It's a draw as such. The rebels, the nationalists, are stopped by members of the international brigades, which had been set up by the stage, and they have also fought in Madrid in November. And Jarama happens, and then a few months later, the Battle of Guadalajara happens, and this is the first time that the Italians have joined battle, and they get routed, basically, in the Battle of Guadalajara in April 1937. By this stage, the nationalists have decided to move and concentrate on mopping up the north coast. They've already taken the frontier, Honday and all that area, and Irún, and they start moving from east to west. Bilbao is next. Then, of course, you get the famous carpet bombing of Guernica, and then they move to Santander, and then eventually they mop up the final elements in Gijón by the summer, late summer, early autumn. In July 1937, the nationalists are surprised by a large organised and planned attack in Brunete, which is to the west of Madrid, where the first reorganised or the first organised Republican army, the Popular Army, Ejército Popular, fights its first big battle. And sadly, it's not really able to take things to a good conclusion, and it becomes a bit of a stalemate. And Franco is probably best known for using the Condor Legion quite extensively in that battle in order to support his troops. By then, we're starting to get into the autumn of 1937, and there's lots going on. Everything that's happened in the north, like I've said already, and the Republicans start an offensive in Aragon that summer. And funnily enough, the Vatican recognizes Franco as the legitimate ruler of Spain at that point as well in that summer. And the Republican government decides to move from Valencia to Barcelona at that stage in the autumn. End of 1937, the Battle of Teruel starts, and this is part of kind of the Aragon front to a certain extent. It's also a battle to try and stop the nationalists from splitting the Republicans by getting to the Mediterranean coast. Franco is able to regain Teruel into 1938, and the nationalists then start their big push in Aragon, and things are going on in other parts of Europe, of course. You've got people like Anthony Eden, who resigns as the foreign minister of Britain at the time because of the government's appeasement in Europe. Some elections have taken place in France, and Daladier, who's quite right-wing, takes over from Lionel Blum. And so there's a lot going on in France as well. And the nationalists arrive on the Mediterranean coast in April 1938, and they start pushing south towards Valencia. And at this point, Negrin, who's in charge of the Republican side, he decides that he's going to try and come up with a peace accord, which is denied by the nationalists. And the Battle of the Ebro, the famous Battle of the Ebro, the last large-scale epic battle of the Spanish Civil War, begins in July 1938 and carries on all the way through to November of that year, which sadly the Republicans lose. That September, the international brigades are withdrawn as a gesture of trying to make peace, which fails sadly because Franco wants to basically totally wipe out the Republic. And of course, by September 1938, things have really taken a turn for the worse, and the Republic realizes that Spain is no longer front and center in people's minds because the Munich Agreement is signed on the 30th of September 1938, which is seen as the final kind of nail in the coffin, really. The international brigades are fully withdrawn from the front, and the nationalists then start pushing into Catalonia in late December, and then really it's all kind of fully downhill. The Republican government, the Republican army are fighting withdrawal all the way through to the French border. And Catalonia falls on the 10th of February 1939. The British and French governments acknowledge and recognise Franco as the leader of Spain. At the end of February 1939, there's a coup d'etat amongst the Republicans in Madrid, Segismundo Casado, and basically what happens then is that lots of other things are going on in the world. You know, Germany invades Czechoslovakia, for example, in March, and nationalists march into Madrid on the 29th of March. And on the 1st of April, Franco declares an end to the Spanish Civil War. And then Second World War starts in September 1939, so it's not that long ago. So that's a summary of the Spanish Civil War. It's a bit mad, but there you go.
There's so much in it. And I'm thinking, I think that last battle, I think Franco's taking part in that physically almost, right? Like he's going up front.
You can actually, if you ever go to Madrid, it's worth going to a place called El Pardo. El Pardo, the Palace of El Pardo, is to the west of the city, next to the Casa de Campo. And El Pardo was traditionally a royal palace, and it was taken over by Franco, and that's where he lived until he died in 1975. And El Pardo is now the home of the Spanish Royal Guard that look after the king. The king lives in a different palace. And in El Pardo, they have a museum, the Royal Guard Museum. It's a fascinating museum. And in there, they've got Franco's caravan that he used. It looks like a bus, basically. It's not that different to the kind of thing that Montgomery used to drive around in, or even Rommel, because Rommel had a stolen British truck, that he used as his caravan. And it's a bright green thing. And yes, he used to go out and check, but he did that a little bit in places like Brunete as well, and on the north as well. He did get around and he did go and have a look at things. But obviously, by the time we get into 1938 and Teruel finishing and the Ebro and all of that, getting to the coast and everything else, you can still see the huge monument on the coast there where Franco kind of celebrated splitting the Republicans up. Yeah, he was there. He was there all the time.
You've covered it so well, and there's so much in it. You just think of all the sayings that kind of have moved into, maybe the Western world, into the left, about Madrid, no pasarán, for example, this kind of thing. Of course, it worked for a while, not forever, unfortunately.
Well, Madrid never fell. I mean, I find it fascinating. You can still go to Madrid, and I'm taking a group to Madrid tomorrow for a week. I'm guiding them around. It's a military group because I'm obviously still serving. I'm guiding a military group around battlefields of the Spanish Civil War next week. And when you go around Madrid, you can still see a lot of the front. It became static trench warfare after the main attack in 1936. And if you walk around the university campus and you go into the medicine faculty, they've got a model, a diorama of all of the trenches. You can go in there and just look at all of that, and you still can't believe that something as horrendous as that could have happened in such a beautiful place. But you can still see bunkers in the middle of some of the parks in the outskirts of Madrid. It's very weird.
Support the mission, one beer at a time. Head to undergroundstrategy.com/support and we'll raise a glass in your honor. Now, let's get back to it.
And I think the narratives afterwards, when I say no pasarán, I meant like it fell eventually by virtue politically, right? There was a surrender. But I take your point completely. And, the narratives afterwards, was Madrid for or against, and people trying to maybe shape that a little bit now or since then. Being the center of the country, the seat of power and all that. And it's so much, like even you mentioned the Italians, and this one maybe not so much. I mean, I think in the real Anglo-Western world, there's definitely the kind of maybe unfair Italian surrendering, right? But we all know that, under Rommel, they fought pretty well, and the partisans fought pretty well too in their own country, etc. But in Spain, I think one of the sayings that came out from that period was, that my dad used to joke with us. They said when the Italians were there, they would say "a la bayoneta" and all this, so to the bayonet, and it doesn't translate well into English. And all the Italians "a la camioneta." So so that would be that it rhymes to go to the pickup.
Yeah. I mean, they were pretty indiscriminate in bombing places like Barcelona. Of course, they used Mallorca as their main air base, and Mallorca became a little Italy. In fact, I think they wanted to keep it at the end of the war, but they weren't allowed to. And the Italians did have a very strong, there were lots of blockades and things like that. And the non-intervention committee, it was a real mess. And the Italians did learn a few things. I mean, you've got the first major tank battle between Axis tank and a Russian tank is in early October 1936, just south of Madrid, between T-26s and Italian tankettes. And I'm taking the group there in a couple of days. And it's a total rout. I mean, the Italians didn't stand a chance, and that's more about the technology than the actual people. And because even though the T-26 was a cracking tank and worked really well for the Republican side, they didn't know how to use it properly. So, it never really came to much, even though there was quite a lot of wide use of armor in some cases. And the Germans, with their kind of first version of the Panzer I, it only had light armor, it only had a machine gun and all that stuff. So they were experimenting quite a lot. But the Italians, they didn't stand much of a chance in that first encounter. Yeah, it's a bit of a... Cesena is called the town. It's just south of Madrid. Yeah.
Well, we'll add some links into the show notes. And hopefully one day I myself and Max will also be able to join you for kind of a podcast on the road,
Yeah, that'd be great. I mean, I'd love to do that. I mean, if you want to do all the main battlefields of Spain, Spain's a big country. A lot of people don't realize how big a country it is. It's nearly 3 times the size of Britain, and it's the second most mountainous country in Europe. It's got, after Switzerland, it's got 5 mountain ranges over 2,500 meters. So it's got 5 mountain ranges touching 10,000 feet. So getting around Spain is quite tricky, but if I could start in Africa, I would. But the best way to start is you start in Seville, you go to Badajoz, then you do Toledo, then you do Madrid, then you do the battles around Madrid. And then you can go to the north and you can look at stuff on the north, the Basque Country, etc. Then you can cut across to the Aragon front, famous, of course, because people like George Orwell were on the Aragon front when he was a member of the Republican Army, the Catalan side. Then you could go to Teruel, and then you can do Barcelona, of course. And you could also do the Mediterranean coast. And then you could finish off by following the route of the retreating army into France. And that's 3 weeks. It's a long time, but it's pretty impressive 3 weeks if you want to look at the battles.
And that, folks, that wraps up part 1 of our discussion with Séan Scullion about the Spanish Civil War. And in the next episode, I know they're going to dig a bit deeper into Franco and the historical memory of Spain. Thank you for listening, and you have a great one. Bye-bye.